Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. If it's Monday, it must be Pablo Torre. Pablo, welcome.
Every time I think there's going to be a slow Monday, the opposite happens. So good to be here again.
Absolutely. So there is so much to choose from, but let's start with a story that you've been intimately involved in, involving the NFL player representative. Lloyd Howell was forced to resign. Tell us why and how this finally came down.
Yeah, so my gosh, we at Pablo Torre finds out. You can subscribe on Substack, www.pablo.show, as you I'm sure well know by now. We published two episodes, two separate hour-long investigative podcasts with documentation of rulings, arbitration rulings between the NFLPA and the NFL that were suppressed in coordination between the league and its ostensible adversary, the players union that Jen just referred to. Lloyd Howell was the guy in charge, the executive director. He has now resigned. Also, by the way, as of Sunday, the chief strategy officer, JC Treader, who's another character we've talked about, Jen, you and me, as well as on these shows that I've done, he's also resigned. And so that is the man who installed Lloyd Howell via a wildly secretive process that involved an amendment to the Constitution, which said to the union representatives who were voting on the executive director, you won't know the identities of the candidates you're voting on until the day that you show up in that voting process, which was a red flag from the beginning. But it proceeds from there. And so what's happened is after I release the first arbitration ruling that was suppressed by confidentiality agreement, ESPN and Don Van Natta and Kalen Kaler also followed up on this reporting, sort of jumping into the pool on this, pushing the story forward. It was revealed that, oh, wait a minute. This guy, beyond being the CFO of Booz Allen, the giant consulting firm, while they had to settle, it turns out, one of the largest financial fraud settlements in U.S. history, also was a guy who tried to expense himself and via staff members, reportedly, strip club visits.
Yes.
So, I mean, look, Jen, there's just a zillion reasons why he had to go. But it
Right.
was sort of the drip, 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 as we see in politics of like, here's the big domino, this collusion ruling, which hid from the union membership most materially information that they could have used in public to gain leverage on the NFL ahead of their collective bargaining agreement coming up in 2030. Instead, it was suppressed to the benefit and the self-interest of Lloyd Howell and J.C. Treader. And in the meantime, here are all the other things we're learning about what they hid in terms of how they got to power, despite ostensibly, thorough background checks, which dredged up everything up to and including, by the way, the fact that he was also a paid part-time consultant for the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm that has now the ability to buy shares of NFL teams, meaning he worked for a business partner of the literal NFL who he's supposed to negotiate against. So 1 zillion reasons for him to go. Finally, both of them, JC and Lloyd, are gone.
Exactly. Now, he was also the defendant in a sexual harassment suit. And they said, oh, we knew about that. We knew about that, as if that was okay and not another red flag. Now,
Correct.
the Carlisle Association, at the time, it wasn't so horrific. Subsequently, however, Carlisle began to pursue a minority stake in teams. So that put Lloyd Howell on both sides of the management labor divide. How did things get this badly out of control? Who's supposed to be watching this, and what fundamental changes are going to need to be made so that they don't come up with the next Lloyd Howell?
Yeah, so the most generous interpretation of every strategy they took was that they were trying to be buddy buddy with the NFL. And so when Lloyd Howell says, whoa, 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 I was only a paid part-time consultant at Carlisle as of the spring of 2023, and I got the job in June of 2023, I could never have known that, of course, the NFL would grant the Carlisle Group permission to be one of this short list members of firms to buy shares in NFL teams. You just have to wonder about why he was chosen at all. Why would corporate guy, he had other board seats, of course, Booz Allen Hamilton was his background. Why would he be the choice? And the choice was, we want to stop being so adversarial with the NFL. That was the goal. That was the maybe if we are nice to the bear won't eat us strategy of this era of the union and the regime that they selected. And so, look, I think that's absurd on its face, but let's just go with it for a second here. Everything that's happened since involving the corruption of the regime, which is, of course, the stuff that was missed in the vetting by the search firm and the executive committee and everyone else involved with this process. J.C. Treader, again, is the guy I keep on naming here. The reality is that there's one key question. If you want to run the union next, the question is, were you around while all of this was happening, and did you do or say anything about it? Just feels like in a real world context, if you want to know about who should lead your union after an unprecedented period of corruption, you got to pick someone who was trying to fight it while they were there, or you got to go outside. I mean, this is just logical to me, Jen. And so whether they do that, that is, of course, the next step in the story.
Strikes me, as much of our conversations do, that there's a political lesson to be learned. And that is when you are adverse to a party that is not always operating in good faith, trying to appease, trying to feed the bear does not always work. And in fact, it winds up corrupting you. And you can take this into the political realm and look what's happened to the Republican Party, which has completely debased itself to Donald Trump, or even some Democrats who have said, well, maybe we won't be so confrontational. And sometimes you just got to fight the fight. And sometimes interests are not aligned. The players have fundamental disagreements with the owners. There's a pot of money. Owners want more of it. The union wants more of it. Those two things don't necessarily go together.
Yeah, and there's another parallel, because I think about politics all the time with this story, because in fact, as with union business, there's an election, right? These are elected leaders. And so the question always is how, frankly, media literate is your electorate?
Yes.
And I see echoes of this in politics, of course, all of the time, where you have reporters who are laying out an evidence-based roadmap for how to assess the truth of something. And yet those reporters are being vilified by those who wish to get away with corruption. That is the story of American politics. That is the story of the NFLPA. And it relies fundamentally on this inertia and distrust and, frankly, lack of media understanding about who we can actually trust here. And I would simply say, as the most basic reminder, because I know I'm preaching to the choir here, given what you have built with the contrarian, I will simply say that oftentimes people who are, let's just say, voters in any context here, in a democratic election, they tend to underrate how the group that has the most common incentive structure as them is, in fact, journalists. We are simply here to try and get to the truth. That is what we make money on, frankly. And that is also what the common interest would be. We're not trying to get these jobs. Who doesn't want the power here? We want the truth. And I'm not going to decry or deny, by the way, the fact that, yes, we got to make a living, we journalists, which is always the spin, right? They're just here for clicks. It's like, well, sure. But the question is, what in our view, if you pick the right, again, assess your sources, assess your journalists, but as a category, that is a category of profession that should actually align with your incentives. And so it's a shame that it doesn't get communicated.
And this, of course, is the fake news argument they use. There's the famous, it's a distraction, as if any issue which impedes the credibility of the people in power would be a distraction. Well, I guess it would be a distraction because you're making them focus on something they don't want to focus on. For players themselves, do you think the average player now understands that they have to be more engaged? Again, there's a political analogy. Voters have to be more engaged. Are the average player, is the average player out there feeling like, oh, I better pay more attention to what the union is doing because these guys need to be watched?
This is a wake-up call, I think. Look, in the history of unions in America, there's always been this tension between those who are disinterested or disincentivized via a lack of feeling like they are actually in a fraternity with their fellow union members, right? Like that's always been at the core of this. It's called organizing for a reason, right? You got to get everybody on the same page. This has always plagued the NFLPA. Again, superstar quarterbacks, lowest rung on the roster guys, not quite the same species financially and otherwise. So all of that is understood. But what I've been heartened to see is that talk of what the union is up to has been spiking. And our reporting has, I think, contributed to that materially. Again, the ESPN follow-ups have been contributing to that materially. There is this question because the story is juicy as well as insane for people to say, wait a minute, that's what this guy's been spending our money on strip clubs. They didn't tell us about all of these skeletons in his closet. We are
Right.
supposed to know something about how the NFL was getting away with attempting collusion and we never knew. Like these are just the obvious things that players should want to know. And I think when we're hearing these players on Twitter, at least, as well as in my reporting, like actually stand up and circulate information via like group chats about like you need to know what's happening here and they're citing our reporting. I think that's a step forward, but it's still, to be very blunt, a giant mess.
Absolutely. In my prior life, I was a labor attorney and worked for the Hollywood studios. There's a very interesting analogy to the Hollywood unions, whether it's SAG, whether it's Directors Guild, whether it's the Writers Guild. There are people at the very top who make more money than the studio executives, who are rolling in money. They really don't sort of need a union. But it's interesting in the entertainment industry, there's always been the sense that they have to look after the little guys. And in fact, they've gone out on strike multiple times for issues that don't affect them because they're Tom Cruise or they're, Meryl Streep or Steven Spielberg, but they take their responsibility to their fellow person seriously. And it's an interesting lesson that they all ultimately benefit because when an issue comes along like AI and people's
Yeah.
identity, they really do have a common interest. So maybe this is a little bit of a wake-up call for the people at the top of the food chain to be a lot more engaged and interested in what happens to the guy at the bottom of the roster.
Now, the interesting thing about sports, because you're totally right, is that it also requires the reverse dynamic. Because what's so hard in sports is, and this is maybe unlike entertainment, although entertainment, of course, is fleeting as a profession as well, if you're any
Yes,
individual, because average career length is like 3 to 4 years.
exactly.
And your weapon in sports, at least, is we're going to sit out games.
Exactly.
Those lower rung on the roster guys, I totally understand why they're like, whoa, 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 we can't afford that. Our
Right,
clock is ticking louder than, you know, Aaron Rodgers or Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady, fill in the blank, Joe Burrow, quarterback here. That
right.
said, though, that said, if you are talking about how to make anything resembling leverage materialize, then you need to be able to plausibly threaten unity when it comes to we're all going to get on the picket line. And
Exactly.
that's something that football more than any other sport, as you know, because of that divergence and the
Yes,
size of these rosters and because of the fleeting nature of these careers, it's the hardest to organize of all.
absolutely. And the shortest season as well. In basketball, if
Yes,
you go out for, a month or two, you still got the rest of the season.
that's
Same with
exactly right.
baseball. So it's a different animal. So let's switch gears entirely and go to maybe the most dominant person in his sport at the current time, and that is Scottie Scheffler. If not for a double bogey, he would have won the Open by a larger margin than anyone in 100 years. He is as dominant, if not more so, than Tiger Woods was at the apex of his career. What makes him so formidable as the guys are watching him just keep going and going? How demoralizing for the guys who are like 10 under par, and here he is. He keeps making birdies, he keeps making par. What makes him so fabulous that stands so far ahead of the field?
I've been thinking about this, and you're right that the anticlimax of the Open was a testament, of course, to Scottie Scheffler's
Yeah,
greatness.
yeah.
Just rare to see it be that boring on the back end,
Yes,
frankly.
yeah, it really was.
So just a true sign of dominance in golf is exactly that. And sort of related, what's been so unique about him is his willingness to be publicly thoughtful and so
Yes,
self-aware about why any of this is, again, fleeting to him.
Exactly.
And so
Exactly.
he gives these press conferences before the Open in which he says, I might enjoy winning a major for like 2 minutes before sort of like the hunger sort of returns, or even still the lack of satiation sets in, right?
Yes.
It doesn't feel like it lasts, that payoff. And I was thinking about this today. Like, we typically hear that from guys in the documentary when it's all over.
Right.
This is Michael Jordan in The Last Dance. This is certainly Lee Trevino in golf himself, talking about how, everybody comes to some realization that I made it to the end of the rainbow. And in fact, I visited it over and over and over again, and it never gave me what I thought was going to be there.
Right.
And Scottie Scheffler knows that in real time. He's saying it before he goes and wins tournaments, majors. And when he does it at a rate that is, at this point, almost in excess of Rory McIlroy, who, again, we regarded as the obvious successor to Tiger Woods, to give you a sense of just how incredible Scottie Scheffler is, I'm just seeing a guy prove that you can be thoughtful and open and almost break the fourth wall while also being focused to the degree that he dominates. And it's just a special psychological combination, Jen, in a sport, of course, that is premised on the resiliency of your psychology. And I think
Yes.
that's essential and differentiating.
Absolutely. And in a way, those two things are linked because you have to love the game. You have to love the process. They always talk about, I have to follow the process because the winning is so fleeting. The game is so unpredictable. It's so bizarre at times. It's so infuriating, so heartbreaking. You have to love the game and love the process. And he plainly does. There are these bizarre moments. How do you explain Rory, taking a shot from the rough and another ball from underneath pops up, impeding his shot? How do you explain these putts that, circle the cup and go away? If you are so invested in only the result, it'll break you. It really will. And what he is saying is, I love the game. I love competing for competition's sake, even as I know that the result is in some cases fleeting or even beyond my control.
Yeah, it's very interesting the needle he's threading, because on
Yeah,
some level, on paper, you hear his quotes before the Open and you're thinking, this guy thinks he's better than golf.
right.
And that's not the case. What
No,
he's actually saying, and he's wanted to clarify, like, he would like his son to play golf
right.
because of these lessons. And again, lessons we've talked about here in the context of Trump, right? You got to
Yeah,
call your own fouls. There is an honor code system, resiliency after failure. Like, all of these
yes,
things are why he loves golf and why he wants his kids to play golf. It is merely the reality that if you are into this sport or sports in general, or frankly, human endeavor in general, if you're
right.
in this for the result, you will be disappointed every time because the result
Exactly.
is not the point. And
Exactly.
I think both of us have talked to enough people in politics and business who have a ton of money, a ton of success, a ton of elections won, and yet there is this hole in their soul, in their spirit, that they
Yes.
are sort of befuddled. Why hasn't it been filled? And Scottie Scheffler, at this young age,
Yeah.
doing all of this in real time, has realized this already. And it's a remarkable thing to hear someone articulate in that position.
Absolutely. Well, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the latest ridiculous act of Trump bullying that he is now telling Cleveland and Washington that in their respective baseball and then football teams, they have to go back to the old insulting Native American mascots.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why does he care? He cares because he's the bully. He wants to tell people what to do. And when he makes these threats, he's going to put restrictions on Washington. One of the Washington councilmen said, like, what restrictions? What's he going to do? He doesn't even care. It's the act of bullying and the act of people want to be sensitive to other people's feelings. I want to be insensitive. I want to tell them to insult other people. It's really pathological.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, look. So when I was at ESPN, and I still remain doing TV over there, as well as
Yes.
a card carrying member of the sports media,
Yes.
I can just tell you that we all debated the mascot issue
Right, to
for
death.
years and beat it to death to the point where everybody on both sides, I think it's safe to say, we became exhausted by it because, again, it's one of those eternal arguments where, on the one hand, the position that I held is, do you want Native Americans to feel welcome at these games, at your sport, in these buildings, right?
Right.
And of course, there is survey data that suggests that some Native Americans have no problem. And in fact, and on and on and on, right? So the polling, you can argue about the free speechness of it, I suppose you can argue about. All of it has immediate parallels and echoes to every culture war topic you've ever heard. Are we being too sensitive or not? The point being, a decision was made, and you could argue, you could wonder, would this same decision be made if these arguments are happening for the first time in 2025? Maybe not. By the way, maybe the outcome, for all of the reasons we observe now, post wokeness, I'm using scare
Yeah.
quotes, maybe there wouldn't be the momentum. Maybe there wouldn't be that public pressure in the same way. But at the same time, gosh, you're, I can get lost in this because it's sort of like, I think all of it is irrelevant to why he's doing it now.
Yes, exactly. And that is so true. He doesn't care what the subject of the
No.
bullying is. It's the act of bullying. And he has no problem going back decades to fight and refight. It kind of reminds me of the Confederate statues and the rest.
Yes, yes,
We
yes,
we
exactly.
want it because you don't, because it offends you, because it besmirches our pledge to be equal and respectful of one another. And that's exactly why I want you to force you to do it. I mean, it's unbelievable. And the reaction of the team owners, I thought was priceless. It was like, you know, we passed this. We're done with that. We have moved on. And it was great to see them have that reaction. It wasn't just the groups that were complaining, it was they themselves. They've made an investment, they've changed their
Yeah.
brand, they've changed their logos. They're not going to go back. That would be insanity.
Nobody is protesting this anymore. The Cleveland Guardians executive was like, a few years ago, yes, we made this choice. Now, by the way, it would cost them money to throw out
Yes, of
again all
course.
so that, like, nobody really wants this. And it's hard not to just put this in the context of the present tense, right? So
Yeah,
Donald Trump is feeling the pressure from his base in a way that is unprecedented because of the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. And whether or
correct.
not your mileage is their mileage on how real that conspiracy is, all you got to know is that Donald Trump would love to play the hits. He would love to make America argue again. Like in the same rerun fashion, Jen, you're right. That is the Confederate statue issue. That is any number of, naming army bases. It's just the same stuff over and over again.
Exactly.
And his desire to have people just spin up into the same old politics of racial grievance is his comfort zone. And he
Absolutely.
wants you to look over there. Sports has always been, as a through line of our conversations, as I've said to you over and over again, Donald Trump doesn't know ball. Donald Trump isn't actually a sports fan. He merely uses it to further his own corruption. And this is yet the latest example, and everybody
Absolutely.
in sports knows it, even if they might feel the pressure because he's going to threaten the Commanders, hey, you want this stadium in DC? I'm going to get in the way, whatever that means.
Exactly. And you're tempted to think of this as the crotchety grandpa on his lazy boy recliner, still railing at the TV. Change the name, change the name. But the difference is this guy's president of the United States. And in your own family, you would ignore grandpa. You would tell grandpa to pipe down. You would roll your eyes. But we elected this guy president. And so we have to put up with this to some degree for a few years going forward. But I think the lesson is, hey, listen, if the Commanders can blow them off, if the Guardians can blow them off, we can blow them off too. We can tell them to pipe down and like roll our eyes, and we don't have to engage.
There's a lesson in Trump and how he handles these things that I think everybody else who is sort of on the opposite side of that aisle would be wise to heed, which is if you just sort of ignore it and just like wait for it to pass, there'll be another thing. You know,
Exactly. Get
like
it on.
you don't actually need to treat it like, oh my God, he's gonna focus on us for eternity and we're never gonna get out from under it. It's like in reality, someone will point a laser pointer somewhere else and they'll look at that. Like he just
Exactly.
can't sustain the effort it takes to actually fight this culture war. He's just gonna be flitting back and forth. I would say the higher ground belongs to those teams and they don't need to cede it. So, you know, there is that.
Absolutely. Well, once again, we have covered the divine aspects of sports in Scottie Scheffler, the corrupt aspects, and through it all, politics and sports have an awful lot in common.
It's hard to avoid the metaphor, and sometimes it's hard to
Yeah,
avoid the reality. And that's why I think these conversations are going to keep going for a long time.
absolutely. Great talking to you again, Pablo. We will see you next week and have a great week.
You too, Jen. Thanks.
Bye bye.